She was 21 years old when her uncle, Thomas Hale, stood in the doorway of the only home she had ever known and told her she was no longer welcome beneath its roof. Behind her stood the donkey, a stubborn gray animal named Biscuit that had once pulled her father's cart, and beside her feet sat a single canvas bag holding everything she owned in this world. Thomas Hale had inherited the farm when her father died of fever the winter before, and he had decided, in the cold arithmetic of a man who saw only burdens and ledgers, that a niece who refused to marry the widower he had chosen for her was a mouth not worth feeding. She walked away from Coldwater Bend, Wyoming territory, with $14 sewn into the hem of her skirt, a donkey who trusted her more than any person left alive, and a silence in her chest that felt like grief wearing the shape of anger. 3 days later, half-starved and sunburned, she heard a rancher mention, almost as a joke, that the old bandit's hideout up in Widow's Ridge was for sale for $2, cursed as it was, since nobody wanted the place where the outlaw Silas Rourke had bled out alone 11 years before. She paid the $2 without letting herself think too hard about it, because $2 for 4 walls and a roof was $2 she could almost afford to lose, and because something about the way the seller wouldn't meet her eyes told her there was more to that stone chimney than anyone in town was willing to say out loud. She did not know yet that behind those blackened stones waited a secret that would settle old debts, unmask a respectable man's oldest lie, and give an entire forgotten town back its future. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Junia Hale. If you have ever felt like the thing everyone else discarded, the thing nobody thought was worth the trouble of keeping, we'd love for you to stay a while and walk this road with us. And if this is the kind of story that finds you, we'd be so grateful if you'd follow or subscribe to the channel, because we've got many more stories like Junia's waiting to be told. Junia had been born on that farm outside Coldwater Bend in the spring of 1860, the only child of Ezra and Miriam Hale, and from her earliest memories the world had smelled of cut hay and river stone and the particular sweetness of her mother's bread cooling on the sill. Ezra Hale was not a wealthy man, but he was a careful one, a stonemason by trade who built chimneys and foundations and low garden walls for half the households in the valley, and he had raised his daughter the way he laid stone, with patience, with attention to what lay beneath the surface, with the conviction that nothing sturdy was ever built in a hurry. He taught her to read the grain of a rock before she could properly read her letters, showing her small hands how to find the hairline seams where a stone wanted to split, how to test the give of mortar with a thumbnail, how a wall built true would outlive the man who raised it. Where other fathers might have kept such knowledge for sons, Ezra Hale had no son, and he refused to believe that a skill worth having was a skill his daughter did not deserve to learn. Miriam, for her part, taught Junia other things, how to keep accounts in a ledger book so that no peddler or merchant could cheat them, how to read a contract closely enough to catch the sentence hiding inside another sentence, how to listen to what people did not say as carefully as what they did. Miriam had been a preacher's daughter from Ohio before she came west, literate in a way many women on the frontier were not, and she made sure her daughter could write a clean hand and add a column of figures twice, and get the same answer both times. It was, Junia would later understand, an unusual education for a girl expected to become nothing more than someone's wife. But her parents seemed to operate on the quiet belief that a woman who could read stone and read numbers would never truly be without resources, whatever else the world took from her. Those years were not without hardship. Droughts came, as they always did in that country, and one bad winter took half their cattle. But there was enough love in that little farmhouse that Junia grew up believing scarcity and warmth could exist in the same room, that a family's wealth was not only measured in coin. She was 14 when her mother died of a fever that swept through the valley, and she remembered standing at the graveside, gripping her father's calloused hand, feeling for the first time that the ground beneath her own life could shift without warning. Ezra never remarried. He grew quieter in the years after, though never unkind, and he leaned on his daughter more and more, teaching her not just the mason's trade, but the business of it, how to bid a job fairly, how to keep good relations with a client even after hard bargaining, how to be the kind of person whose word, once given, could be trusted absolutely. By the time Junia was 19, she could lay a chimney as true as any man in 3 counties, though she rarely got the chance to prove it, since most households would not hire a woman for the work, no matter how steady her hands were. Still, her father was proud of her in a way he said aloud only rarely, but showed in 100 small ways: the extra portion at supper, the tools he gave her one by one until she had her own set, the way he introduced her to other tradesmen as my apprentice, rather than merely my daughter. It was this foundation, this quiet inheritance of skill and steadiness, that Junia carried with her long after the ground gave way beneath everything else she had. The fall came fast, the way these things often do, arriving less like a single blow than like a series of small betrayals, stacked one atop another, until the whole structure collapsed. Ezra Hale caught a chill in the autumn of 1880 that settled into his lungs and would not leave, and by the time the first snow fell, he was gone, leaving Junia 20 years old and alone on a farm that, she soon discovered, was not entirely her own. Her father, it turned out, had borrowed against the land some years before to cover a lean season, and the note had been co-signed, for reasons Junia never fully understood until later, by his younger half-brother Thomas, a man who had drifted through the territory doing little of substance for a decade before settling nearby with ambitions considerably larger than his character. Thomas Hale arrived within a week of the funeral, grief nowhere in evidence on his face, carrying papers that named him executor and, more importantly, part owner of the farm by virtue of that old debt. Junia, still numb with mourning, did not have the strength or the legal knowledge to fight him, and Thomas moved quickly, the way men like him always did, to consolidate what he considered rightfully his. He informed her, not unkindly at first, that a woman alone could not run a farm, that it would be sensible for her to marry, and he had already taken the liberty of speaking to a widower named Cyrus Peel, a man twice her age with 3 children, and a reputation for a temper that emptied rooms. When Junia refused, quietly, but with the same steadiness her father had built into her, Thomas's patience thinned considerably. He began speaking of her as ungrateful, as a burden he had generously chosen to shelter, and within a month he had convinced himself, and was busy convincing the town, that he was the wronged party in this arrangement, magnanimously supporting a headstrong niece who would not do what was best for herself. The final break came on a gray morning in early spring, when Junia found Thomas going through her father's tool chest, selling off pieces of the mason's kit to a trader passing through. The same tools Ezra had given her one by one, the tools that were, in every way that mattered, hers. When she objected, Thomas's temper finally showed its true shape, and he told her plainly that the farm was his now, that she had overstayed whatever welcome she imagined she had, and that she ought to be grateful he hadn't turned her out sooner. She packed what she could into a single canvas bag that night, a few of her mother's letters, the ledger book Miriam had taught her to keep, the handful of mason's tools Thomas hadn't yet sold, and $14 in coin that represented the entirety of her savings from small jobs she'd done in secret over the winter, laying stone for neighbors who paid her quietly and did not ask Thomas's permission. She took Biscuit, the old donkey, because no one else wanted him, and because he had never once looked at her like she was a burden. And so at 21 years old, with the sun barely up and her breath fogging in the cold, Junia Hale walked off the only land she had ever called home. Uncertain of where she would sleep that night. Certain only that she would rather face the unknown than spend one more day being made small by a man who had never once earned the right to make her feel that way. For 3 days she walked the roads between farmsteads, trading small labor, mending a fence, patching a roof, hauling water, for meals and a place in a barn to sleep, watching her $14 sit untouched in her skirt hem, because she understood, with her mother's practical clarity, that money spent carelessly now would mean starvation later. It was on the third evening, in a rundown trading post outside the settlement of Widow's Ridge, that she overheard 2 ranch hands laughing about a piece of land nobody would touch, the old hideout up in the rocks where the bandit Silas Rourke had died more than a decade before. Bleeding out alone after a robbery gone wrong, his gang scattered or hanged, his loot never recovered despite years of men digging up half the hillside looking for it. The land had passed through the county's hands, and then to a local merchant named Cobb Whitfield, who wanted nothing to do with it, and had listed it for whatever anyone would pay, which at the moment happened to be $2, a price so low it was less a sale than a way of getting rid of a problem. Junia listened to the men describe the place, a squat stone cabin with a single room, a chimney her father would have called honest work, walls that had somehow withstood 11 years of neglect and superstition, and something in her, some instinct passed down from a man who had spent his whole life reading what stone could tell you, told her this was worth $2 of her 14, even if it turned out to be nothing but 4 walls and bad memory. She found Cobb Whitfield the next morning and paid him the $2 before he could talk himself into raising the price, and he counted the coins into his palm with visible relief, telling her, almost as an afterthought and with the particular carelessness of a man who did not believe his own warning, that she oughtn't go poking around that chimney too hard, since folks said Rourke had been strange about it near the end, wouldn't let his own men near it, and died with his back against those very stones like he was guarding something even as the life left him. Junia thanked him and said nothing of what she was already thinking, because a girl raised by a mason knew that when a man tells you not to look too closely at his stonework, that is precisely where you ought to look. The hideout sat a mile up a dry wash from the main road, tucked into a fold of rust-colored rock, where the wind had scoured the soil thin and stubborn juniper grew sideways out of the cracks. The cabin itself was smaller than she'd pictured, one room built low and squat against the weather, its roof sagging but intact, its door hanging by a single working hinge. She led Biscuit inside and stood a long moment, simply breathing the stale, dust-heavy air, feeling the strange hush of a place that had not held a living voice in over a decade. The chimney dominated the far wall, a good 8 feet of fieldstone rising through the roofline, and even in the dim light slanting through the single window, Junia could see immediately what 11 years of superstitious neighbors apparently never had, that the mortar joints on the lower courses were not original work. Her father's training rose in her like a current original mortar aged a certain gray, crumbled in a certain pattern, while these joints, though weathered to nearly match, held a slightly different color where the light caught them right, a slightly tighter set. Someone had opened that chimney after it was built, and closed it again, and done it well enough to fool anyone who hadn't spent a childhood learning to read stone the way other children learn to read words. She spent that first evening simply cleaning, sweeping out pack-rat nests, airing the single moth-eaten cot, boiling water over a fire built from scrap wood, telling herself she would look at the chimney properly once she had light enough and strength enough to do it right. But she couldn't entirely help herself, and before full dark she ran her fingers along the seam she'd spotted. Found where a thin, flat stone near the hearth's base gave slightly under pressure where its neighbors did not, and worked it loose with the edge of her father's old chisel until it slid free and revealed, in the cavity behind it, a small tin box wrapped in oilcloth, gone brittle with age. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside lay a handful of gold coins, not a fortune, perhaps $30 worth, but more money than she had held in her life. And beneath the coins, folded small and tight, a single page torn from a ledger book, written in a cramped, urgent hand that stopped mid-sentence, as though the writer had been interrupted or had simply run out of strength to finish. She could make out only fragments in the failing light, a list of names she didn't recognize, numbers beside them, and at the top underlined twice, the words what is owed, God forgive me for the waiting. She sat back on her heels in the gathering dark, the tin box heavy in her lap, and understood that Cobb Whitfield's $2 had bought her a great deal more than a roof. She spent the following days working the mystery the way her father had taught her to work a wall, patiently, one stone at a time, testing each piece before trusting it to bear weight. By lamplight she studied the torn ledger page until she had it memorized, and slowly, through careful questioning of old-timers in Widow's Ridge, who remembered the years before Rourke's death, a shape began to emerge that was nothing like the story the territory had told itself for a decade. Silas Rourke, it turned out, had not always been simply an outlaw. Before he'd taken to robbery, he had worked as a bookkeeper for the Cattlemen's Trust Bank in the county seat, under a manager named Elias Grunwald, and according to two elderly ranchers who'd known him in those earlier years, Rourke had left that position abruptly after discovering, or so the rumor went, dismissed at the time as a disgruntled clerk's fantasy, that Grunwald had been quietly foreclosing on struggling ranch families using falsified debt records, seizing land at a fraction of its worth and reselling it at enormous profit through a chain of associates that obscured his own hand in the matter. Rourke, unable to prove the scheme through legitimate channels and unwilling to simply walk away, had apparently decided on a different, more dangerous form of justice. Over the following 2 years, he had robbed not banks in general, but specifically shipments and safes connected to Grunwald's network, taking back, piece by piece, sums that corresponded with unsettling precision to the amounts Grunwald had stolen from those same ransacked families. He had become, in the eyes of the law, simply another outlaw, his gang eventually turning on itself and scattering after a botched job left 2 men dead. Rourke himself fleeing alone to the hideout with what remained of the recovered money he seemed to have intended, according to that torn ledger page, to eventually return to the families it belonged to, before fever or a lingering wound or simple exhaustion caught up with him first, alone against his own chimney, the restitution list unfinished in his hand. The gold coins in the tin box were, Junia realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air, only a fraction of what the full ledger must have accounted for, a working stash perhaps, meant to fund the effort, while the true record of debts and repayments had likely been hidden more completely. Somewhere Rourke trusted enough to survive him even if he did not. She thought of her father's hands teaching her where a wall wanted to split, and she began, in earnest, to take the chimney apart. It took her 4 days of careful, exhausting work, freeing stones one at a time and marking each with chalk so she could rebuild the structure true once she was through. And on the 4th evening, in a cavity deeper and better concealed than the first, wrapped in a square of oiled canvas that had kept the damp mostly at bay, she found the rest of it, a full ledger book, its pages dense with Rourke's cramped hand, listing family names across 3 counties, the sums Grunwald's scheme had taken from each of them, and beside many entries, notations showing partial or full amounts already recovered and set aside, along with a final page, unfinished, that read simply, "I meant to see this done proper. If another finds this before I can, I ask you, give it back to them, not to me, not to the law that never once asked why a bank clerk quit without a word of complaint filed. They will not believe a dead outlaw. Perhaps they will believe the stones." Beneath the ledger, folded into a second oilcloth packet, sat the remainder of the recovered money. Not a bandit's fortune in the way legend had painted it, but a substantial sum, several $100s in gold and banknotes, along with several original mortgage documents Rourke had apparently stolen back directly. Documents that would prove, in black and white, the falsified debts Grunwald had used to seize those families' land in the first place. Junia sat on the floor of that little stone cabin with the ledger open across her knees, the lamp burning low, and felt something shift inside her chest that was larger than shock, larger even than the dizzying knowledge of what she now held. She thought of her own uncle, of the casual cruelty with which men like Thomas Hale and, it seemed, Elias Grunwald simply took what was not theirs, because no one with power had ever stopped them, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost like her mother speaking through her, that she had not merely inherited a bandit's hidden treasure. She had inherited his unfinished conscience, and it was now hers to finish for him. Word travels fast in small territories, and it did not take long for Widow's Ridge to learn that the Hale girl living up at the old Rourke place had been seen in town asking careful questions about old land records and the history of the Cattlemen's Trust Bank. Junia had tried to be discreet, visiting the county recorder's office under the pretense of researching her own father's old contracts, cross-referencing the names in Rourke's ledger against the official land transfers of a decade past, and finding, entry after sickening entry, that the falsified foreclosures matched precisely families who had supposedly defaulted on debts they had, according to Rourke's careful notation, already paid. Families who had lost their homesteads to a bank that then quietly resold the land to buyers, connected, however distantly, to Elias Grunwald himself. Grunwald was no longer a bank manager. In the years since, he had built himself into one of the most respected men in the county. A bank president now, a deacon at the church, a man whose name appeared on the cornerstone of the new schoolhouse. It was inevitable, given how small that country was, that he would hear a young woman was asking questions about old land transfers connected to the Rourke hideout, and it was inevitable, too, that a man who had buried a crime so thoroughly for over a decade would not simply let a girl with $14 to her name unbury it. He came to her himself 3 weeks after she'd bought the property, arriving at the cabin in a fine black coat entirely wrong for the dust of the wash. And he was polite in the way dangerous men often are, offering to buy the hideout back from her for $50. An absurd sum for $2 worth of stone and rot, he said, simply because he had a sentimental fondness for the old place, having known Rourke slightly in his younger years. Junia, who had spent a lifetime learning to hear what people did not say, understood immediately that $50 was not generosity, but fear wearing a gentleman's coat, and she declined as politely as he had offered, telling him only that she'd grown fond of the place herself. Grunwald's courtesy thinned considerably after that. Over the following 2 weeks, the pressure mounted in the quiet, deniable ways such pressure always does, in places where one man holds most of the money. The trading post suddenly could not extend her credit. A rancher who'd promised her masonry work found reasons to cancel. And one night someone rode close enough to her cabin in the dark to send a rock crashing through her window, though no one was ever seen to claim responsibility. Thomas Hale, hearing rumors that his discarded niece had somehow come into money, arrived uninvited as well. oily with rediscovered affection, suggesting that family ought to share in whatever fortune she'd found, and Junia found a strange, steadying clarity in refusing him too, in feeling, for the first time since her father's death, that she was not required to soften herself for men who had only ever valued her when there was something to be gained. She understood that Grunwald, unlike her uncle, was genuinely dangerous, a man with the law's own officers dining at his table and the county newspaper printing whatever he suggested. And she knew that a lone woman's word, even backed by a dead outlaw's ledger, would mean little against a respected banker's denial, unless she was very careful and very patient, and willing to let the stones, as Rourke himself had written, do the speaking that a living voice could not. She spent the next fortnight building her case the way her father had taught her to build a foundation, one verified stone at a time, refusing to move until each piece was solid beneath the next. She copied the ledger entries by hand into her mother's old account book, so she would have a second, independent record even if the original vanished. She rode to 3 of the families named in Rourke's ledger: the Alvarados, whose orchard land had been seized on a debt they'd never truly owed, and the elderly widow Prudence Coy, whose late husband's ranch had gone the same way, and the Marsh family, still scraping a living on rented land that had once been theirs outright, and to each she showed the mortgage documents Rourke had stolen back, watching disbelief crack slowly into something like grief and something like hope on faces that had stopped expecting either. She learned that Rourke, whatever else he'd been, had not lied in that unfinished note. Every name matched a real family. Every sum matched a real theft. And by the time she had spoken to a 4th household, 3 others, and a 5th, word of what she carried had begun to travel through Widow's Ridge on its own. Faster now than Grunwald could quiet it, because there is no pressure a wealthy man can apply that outruns the news that his neighbors were robbed, and he was the one who did it. She was careful, too, to bring in a young circuit lawyer named Abel Foss, who rode through the territory twice a year, a man with no particular loyalty to Grunwald's bank, and an evident hunger to make a name prosecuting exactly the sort of scheme the ledger documented, and together they built a formal accounting, cross-referencing county records against Rourke's private notations, until the pattern stood undeniable even to eyes that wanted very badly not to see it. Grunwald, sensing the tide turning against a man who had believed himself untouchable, made one final attempt, arriving again at her cabin, the courtesy entirely gone now, offering first money and then something closer to a threat, reminding her that a woman alone in that country had few protections and fewer friends, that accidents happened to people who made themselves inconvenient. Junia stood in the doorway of the cabin her father's kind of patience had taught her to search, with Biscuit shifting uneasily behind her, and the ledger locked safely in Abel Foss's possession 40 miles away, and told Elias Grunwald, in a voice that did not shake though her hands wanted to, that she had already given copies of everything to 3 families, a lawyer, and the county recorder, and that whatever happened to her now would only confirm to every person in the territory exactly what kind of man he truly was. He left without another word, and something in the set of his shoulders as he rode away told her, more than any promise could have, that he understood the ground beneath him had already given way. The reckoning, when it came, was not the dramatic courtroom spectacle of a dime novel, but something slower and, in its way, more thorough. Abel Foss filed the documentation with the Territorial Land Office and the county court within the month, and the sheer weight of matched records, real ledgers against real deeds, against real families still living, still able to testify, proved impossible for even Grunwald's considerable influence to bury. He was not hanged, nor run out of town at gunpoint, for Junia had wanted no such theater, and the law, slow as it was, had its own quieter mechanisms. He was instead stripped of his bank presidency within the season as the territorial regulators moved in. His falsified foreclosures voided by court order. The stolen properties returned, or their value repaid from accounts the investigation uncovered, had been swollen for years by exactly the kind of theft Rourke had died trying to undo. He left the county before the following winter, his name synonymous now with the thing he had spent a decade building a reputation to hide. And the schoolhouse cornerstone bearing his name was quietly, without ceremony, replaced. Junia, for her part, wanted nothing of the fortune for herself beyond what fairness required. She used a portion of the recovered gold to formally purchase, at honest prices, several parcels of land the ruling had freed up, land she then worked with Abel Foss to place into a trust benefiting the very families Rourke's ledger had named, ensuring no single person, including herself, could ever again seize a community's land through the kind of paper trickery that had ruined so many. The Alvarados got their orchard back outright. Prudence Coy, too old now to work land herself, received a standing income from the trust for the rest of her life. The Marsh family bought back their homestead for $1, a price Junia insisted upon specifically because it echoed, in its smallness, the very insult that had been done to them, except now turned toward restoration instead of theft. And the hideout itself, the little stone cabin with its honest, well-mended chimney, Junia kept, not as a monument to a bandit, but as the place where she had finally understood what her father's lessons in reading stone had truly been preparing her for all along. Not simply a trade, but a way of seeing what other people walked past without noticing, of understanding that value long overlooked does not stop being real merely because no one has bothered to look closely. And so, we return, as we always do, to where we began, to a 21-year-old woman standing in a doorway with a donkey and $14, cast out by a man who believed she was worth nothing more than the burden of feeding her. Junia Hale never set out to expose a banker or restore a dead outlaw's unfinished conscience. She set out only to survive, to find some small, cheap shelter against a world that had just shown her how quickly it could take everything away. But she carried with her, whether she fully knew it at the time, a father's patient way of reading what lay beneath the surface, and a mother's insistence that a woman who could read numbers and words clearly would never be entirely without power, whatever else was stripped from her. It was that inheritance, not gold, not luck, but attention, patience, and an unwillingness to look away from what others had decided wasn't worth noticing, that let a $2 ruin become the instrument of an entire community's restoration. Silas Rourke died alone against that chimney, his justice unfinished, his name remembered only as a warning. Junia Hale finished what he could not, and in doing so, turned a story of loss into one of quiet, deliberate repair. She did not do it for gold, and she did not do it for glory. She did it because somewhere beneath the ash and the broken stone, a dead man's unfinished sentence had asked simply to be completed, and because a girl who had once been told she was worth almost nothing understood, better than most, exactly what it felt like to have your true value walked past by people too careless to look twice. Thank you for spending this time with Junia Hale and the hideout that gave a forgotten town back its future. If her story moved you, we'd be so grateful if you would share it with someone who needs to hear that being overlooked is not the same as being worthless. And if you're new here, please consider staying a while longer with us. We'd love to know, has there ever been a moment in your own life when something everyone else had written off turned out to hold more value than anyone expected? A home, an object, or even a person? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. And your stories are what make this little corner of the internet feel like a true gathering place. Until next time, stay close, and remember that the things worth the most are so often the ones the world has already decided to forget.